You are listening to a reading of When I Was a Little Girl by Zona Gale. This book is part of the Project Gutenberg Foundation, and you can find this and many other books on the website projectgutenberg.org. Chapter 4, The Picnic. It was Delia Dart who had suggested our Arbor Day picnic. "Let's have some fun Arbor Day," she said. We had never thought of Arbor Day in that light. Exercises, though they presented the open advantage of escape from the school ground, were no special fun. Fun was something much more intimate and intangible, definite and mysterious and casual and thrilling, and other anomalies. "Doing what?" we demanded. "Oh," said Delia restlessly, "go off somewhere and eat things, and do something to tell about and make their eyes stick out." We were not old enough really to observe this formula for adventure. Hitherto we had always gone merely because we went. Yet all three motives appealed to us, and events fostered our faint intention. At the opening of school that morning, Miss Messmore made an announcement. I remember her grave way of smiling and silent waiting, so that we hung on what she was going to say. "Tomorrow," she said, "is Arbor Day. All who wish will assemble here at the usual hour in the afternoon. We are to plant trees and shrubs and vines about the schoolhouse. There will be something for each one to plant, but this is not required. Any who do not wish to participate or be present may remain away, and they will not be marked absent. Only those may plant trees who wish to plant trees. I hope that all children will take advantage of their opportunity. Classes will now pass to their places." Delia telegraphed triumphantly in several directions. We could hardly wait to confer. At recess, we met immediately at the closet under the stairs, a closet intended primarily for chalk, erasers, brooms, and maps, but by virtue of its window and its privacy, put to sub-uses of secret committee meetings. "I told you," Delia said, and such was Delia's magnetism that we felt that she had told us. "Let's take our lunch and start as soon as we get out." "Couldn't we go after the exercises?" Callista Waters submitted waveringly. "After?" Delia said scornfully. "It will be 3 o'clock. That's no fun. We want to start by 12, prompt, and stay till 6. Margaret Amelia Rodman bore out Delia's contention. She and Betty had a dozen eggs served up from their pullets. They would boil them and bring them. "The pullets?" Callista demanded aghast, and was laughed into subjection, and found herself agreeing and planning in order to get back into favor. Delia and the Rodmans were, I now perceive, born leaders of medieval living. "Why don't you wait until Saturday?" I finally said, from out a silence that had tried to produce this earlier. "That's only 2 days. "Saturday," said Delia. "Anybody can have a picnic Saturday. This is most as good as running away." And of course it was, but... "Who wants to plant a tree?" Delia continued. "They'll plant all they've got whether we're here or not, won't they?" That was true. They would do so. It was clearly a selfish wish to participate that was agitating Callista and me. In the end, we were outvoted, and we went. Our families, it seemed, all took the same attitude. We need not plant a tree if we did not wish to plant trees. Save in the case of Harold Rodman. He was ruled to be too small to walk to Prospect Hill. and he preferred going back to school to staying at home alone. "I won't plant no tree, though," he announced resentfully as we left him. "I'm going to dig 'em all up," he shouted after us. "Every one in the world." Mary Elizabeth was sitting flat on the ground, cleaning knives, which I recognized as our kitchen knives. This she was doing by a simple process, not unknown to me, and consisting of driving the knife into the ground up to its black handle and shoving it rapidly up and down. It struck me as very strange that she should be there, in our backyard, cleaning our knives, and I somewhat resented it, for it is curious how much of a savage a little girl in a white apron can really be. But then I did not at once recognize her as the little girl whom I had seen in the wood yard. It was when I was running around the house to get my lunch that I came for the second time face to face with Mary Elizabeth. I remember her sometimes as I saw her that day. She had straight brown hair the color of my own, and her thick pigtail, which had fallen over her shoulder as she worked, was tied with red yarn. Her face was a lovely even cream color, with no freckles, such as diversified as my own nose, and with no other color in her cheek. Her hands were thin and veined, with long, agile fingers. The right sleeve of her reddish plaid dress was by now slit almost to the shoulder, and her bare arm showed, and it was nearly all wrist. She had on a boy's heavy shoes, and these were nearly without bottoms. "What are you doing?" I inquired, coming to a standstill. She lifted her face and smiled. Not a flash of a smile, but a slow smile of understanding me. "This," she replied, and went on with her task. "What's your name?" I demanded. "Mary Elizabeth," she answered, and did not ask me my name. This was her pathetic way of deference to me because my clothing and my station were other than hers. I went on to the house, but I went looking back. "Mother," I said, "who is she, the little girl out there?" While she put up my lunch in the Indian basket, Mother told me how Mary Elizabeth had come that morning asking for something to do. She had set her to work, and meanwhile she was finding out who she was. "I gave her something to eat," Mother said, "and I have never seen even you so hungry." Hungry and having no food, I had never heard of such a thing at first hand, not nearer than in books and in Sunday school, but hungry that way in our yard. It was chiefly this that accounted for my invitation to her, this, and the fact that as she came to the door to tell my mother good-bye and to take what she had earned, she gave me again that slow, understanding me smile. Anyway, as we walked to the gate, I overtook her with my Indian basket. "Don't you want to come to the picnic with us?" I asked. She stared at me. "What do you do?" she asked. "Why," I said, "a picnic. Eat in the woods and get things and sit on the grass. Don't you think they're fun?" "I never was to one," she answered. But I saw how she was watching me almost breathlessly. "Come on, then," I insisted carelessly. "Honest?" she said. "Me?" When she understood, I remembered how she walked beside me, looking at me as if she might at any moment find out her mistake. Delia, waiting impatiently at our gate with her own basket. Somehow I never waited at the gate of others, but it was always they who waited at mine. Bade me hurry, stared at Mary Elizabeth, and severely turned her back on her. "This," I said, "is Mary Elizabeth. I asked her to go to our picnic. She's going. I've got enough lunch. This is Delia." I suppose that they looked at each other furtively. So much of the stupidity of being a knight with one's visor lowered yet hangs upon us. And then Delia plucked me visibly by the sleeve and addressed me, audibly in the ear. "What'd you go and do that for?" said she, and I, who at an early age resented being plucked by the sleeve as a bird resents being patted on the head, or the wall of any personality trembles away when it's tapped, took Mary Elizabeth by the hand and marched on to meet the Rodman and Callista. Callista was a vague little soul with no sense of facts. She was always promising to walk with two girls at recess, which was equivalent to asking two to be her partners in a quadrille. It simply could not be done. So Callista was forever having to promise to run errands with someone after school to make amends for not having walked with her at recess. She seldom had a grievance of her own, but she easily fell in with the grievances of others. When I presented Mary Elizabeth to her, Callista received her serenely as a part of the course of human events, and so I think she would have continued to regard her without great attention, and certainly with no criticism, had she not received the somewhat powerful suggestion of Delia and Margaret Amelia and Betty Rodman. The three fell behind Mary Elizabeth and me as we walked down the long street, on which the April sun smoked with summer heat. Over across the railroad tracks and picks up tin cans and old robbers and sells them and drinks just awful and got tea and got 10 children and got arrested, I heard Delia recounting. "The idea to our picnic," said Margaret Amelia's thin-edged voice. "Without asking us," Betty whispered, anxious to think of something of account to say. Mary Elizabeth heard. I've seen that look of dumb, unresentful suffering in many a human face, in the faces of those who by the laws of sport or society or of jurisprudence find no escape. She had no anger, and what she felt must have been long familiar. "I'd better go home," she said to me briefly. I still had her by the hand, and it was, I am bound to confess, as no current, but chiefly as antagonistic to the others, that I pulled her along. "You got to come," I reminded her. "You said you would." It was cruel treatment, by way of kindness. The others, quickly adapting themselves, fell into the talk of expeditions, which is never quite the same as any other talk, and the only further notice that they took of Mary Elizabeth was painstakingly to leave her out. They never said anything to her, and when she ventured some faint word, they never answered or noticed or seemed to hear. In later years, I have had occasion to observe among the undeveloped these same traces of tribal antagonisms. As we went, I had time to digest the hints which I had overheard concerning Mary Elizabeth's estate. I knew that a family having many children had lately come to live across the tracks, and that because of our anxiety to classify, the father was said to be a drunkard. I looked stealthily at Mary Elizabeth, with a certain respect born of her having experience so transcending my own, telling how many drunken men and how many dead persons, if any, we had seen, was one of our modes of recreation when we foregathered. Technically, Mary Elizabeth was, I perceived, one of the vague poor children for whom we had long packed baskets, and whom we used to take for granted as barbarously as they used to take for granted the plague. You know that I knew one such face to face. She seemed so much less a poor child than a little girl. And though she said so little, she had a priceless manner of knowing what I was driving at, which not even Margaret Amelia and Betty Rodman had. And they were the daughters of assemblymen, and had a furnace in their house, and had gold watches for Christmas. It was very perplexing. "First one finds a Mayflower is going to be a princess," Delia shouted. Delia was singularly unimaginative. The idea of royalty was her single entrance to fields of fancy. The stories that I made up always began, "Once there was a fairy." Margaret and Betty started at gnomes and dwarfs. Callista usually selected a poor little match girl or a boot black asleep in a piano box. But Delia invariably chose a royal family with many sons. We ran shouting across the stretch of scrub oak, which stretched where the town blocks of houses and streets gave it up and reverted to the open country. To reach this unprepossessing green place, usually occupied by a decrepit wagon and a pile of cordwood, was like passing through a doorway into the open. We expressed our freedom by shouting and scrambling to be princesses. All that is, save Mary Elizabeth. She went soberly about, a little apart, and I wished with all my heart that she might find the first Mayflower, but she did not do so. We hunted for windflowers. It was on Prospect Hill that these first flowers, windflowers, pasque-flowers, Mayflowers, however one has learned to say them, were found in spring. The anemone pattern, which next to pussy willows themselves meant for us spring. A week before, Nellie Pitmuth had brought to school the first that she had seen. Nellie had our pity because she drove the cows to pasture before she came to school, but she had her reward, for it was always she who found the first spoils. I remember those mornings when I would reach school to find a little group about Nellie, in whose hands would be pussy willows or the first violets or our rarely found white violets. For a little while, in the light of real events like these, Nellie enjoyed distinction. Then she relapsed into her usual social obscurity and the stigma of her gingham apron, which she wore even on half-holidays. This day we pressed hard for her laurels, scrambling in the deep mold and dead leaves in search of the star faces on silvery, silken, furry stems. We hoped untiringly that we might someday find arbiters, which grew in abundance only 18 miles away on the hills. In summer we patiently looked for wintergreen, which they were always finding farther up the river. And from the undoubted dearth of both we escaped with a pretense to the effect that we were under a spell, and that some day, the witch having died, we should walk on our hill and find the wintergreen come and the arbiters under the leaves. By 5 o'clock we had been hungry for 2 hours, and we spread our lunch on the crest. Prospect Hill was a place to which we took our guests when we had them. It was the wide west gateway of the town, wherethrough few ventured, for it opened out on the bend of a little river, navigable only to rowboats and launches, and flowing towards us from the west. You stood at the top of a sharp declivity, and it was like seeing a river face to face to find it flowing straight towards you, out of the sky, bearing little green islands and wet yellow sandbars. It almost seemed as if these must come floating towards us and bringing us everything. For these were the little days when we still believed that everything was necessary. We quickly dispatched the process of trading off a sandwich for an apple, a cookie for a cake, and so on, occasionally trading back before the bargain had been tasted. Mary Elizabeth sat on one side, even after I had divided my lunch and given her my basket for a plate. She sat a very little away from us, or it may be my remembrance of her aloofness that makes this seem so. Each of the others gave her something from her basket, but it was a kind of giving which makes one know what a sad word is the word bestow. they bestowed these things. Since that time, when I have seen folk administering charity, I have always thought of the manner, ill-bred as is all condescension, in which we must have shared our picnic food with Mary Elizabeth. I believe that this is the first conversation that ever I can remember. Up to this time, I had talked as naturally as a night secretes dreams, with no sense of responsibility for either to mean anything. But that day I became uncomfortably conscious of the trend of the talk. I have to have my new dress tried on before supper, Delia announced, her back to the river and her mouth filled with a jam sandwich. It's blue plaid, with blue buttons and blue tassels on it, she volunteered. My new dress Aunt Harriet brought me from the city isn't going to be made up until the last day of school, Margaret Amelia informed us. It's got pink flowers in it, and it costs 60 cents a yard. Margaret and I are going to have white shoes before we go visiting, Betty remembered. I got 2 new dresses that ain't made up yet. Mama says I got so many I don't need them, observed Callista, with an indifferent manner and a soft, triumphant glance, whereat we all sat silent. I struggled with the moment, but it was too much for me. I got a white silk lining to my new dress, I let it be known. It's made, but I haven't had it on yet. China silk, I added, conscientiously. Then, moved perhaps by a common discomfort, we all looked toward Mary Elizabeth. I think I loved her from that moment. None of you's got the new style sleeve, she said serenely, and held aloft the arm whose sleeve was slit from wrist to shoulder. We all laughed together, and Delia pounced upon the arm she caught and held it. "What's that on your arm?" she cried, and we all looked. From the elbow up, the skin was mottled a dull, ugly purple, as if rough hands had been there. Mary Elizabeth flushed. "Ain't you ever had any bruises on you?" she inquired in a tone so finely modulated that Delia actually hastened to defend herself from the impeachment of inexperience. "Sure," she said heartily. "I counted them last night. I got 7. I got 5, and a great long skin," Betty competed hotly. "Pooh," said Callista. "I've got a scratch longer than my hand is. Teacher said maybe I'd get an infect," she added importantly. Then we kept on neutral ground, such as blank books and 4th of July and planning to go barefoot some day, until Callista attacked a pickled peach which she had brought. "Our whole cellar's full of pickled peaches," I incautiously observed. "I could have brought some if I'd thought." "We got more than that," said Delia instantly. "We got 1,000 glasses of jelly left from last year." 1,000, repeated Margaret Amelia in dissension. 100, you mean? Well, Delia said, it's a lot. And jars and jars and jars of preserves. And cans and cans and cans. The others took it up. Why we should have boasted of the quantity of fruit in our parent cellars, I have no notion. Serve that it was the unidentified reason which impels all boasting. When I am in a very new bit of country, where generalizations and multiplications follow every fact, I am sometimes reminded of the fashion of our talk, whose statements tried to exceed themselves in a kind of pyrotechnic pattern, bursting at last into nothing and into the night. We might have been praising climate or crops or real estate. Mary Elizabeth spoke with something like eagerness. "We got a bottle of blackberry cordial my grandmother made before she died," she said. "We keep it in the top bureau drawer." "What a funny place to keep it," Delia began, and stopped of her own accord. I remember that everybody was willing enough to let Mary Elizabeth help pick up the dishes. Then she took a tree for Pussy Wants a Corner, which always follows the picnic 70 part of the picnic. But hardly anyone would change trees with her, and by the design which masks a chance, Everyone ran to another tree. At last she casually climbed her tree, agile as a cat, a feat which Delia alone was shabby enough to pretend not to see. We started homeward when the red was flaming up in the west and falling deep in the heart of the river. By then Mary Elizabeth was almost at ease with us, but rather, I think, because of the soft evening, and perhaps in spite of our presence. "Oh!" she cried. "Somebody grabbed the sun and pulled it down. I saw it go." Delia looked shocked. "You oughtn't to tell such things," she reproved her. Mary Elizabeth flung up the arm with the torn sleeve and ran beside us, laughing with abandon. We were all running down the slope in the red light. "We're Indians looking for roots for the medicine man," Delia called. "Yellow Thunder is sick. So is Redbird. We're hunting roots." She was ahead and we were following. We caught at the dead mullein stalks and milkweed pods and threw them away, and leaped up and pulled at the low branches with their tender buds. We were filled with the flow of the spring and seeking to express it, as in the old barbaric days, by means of destruction. At the foot of the slope a little maple tree was growing, tentative as a sunbeam, and scarcely thicker left by the spring that had last been that way. When she reached it, Delia laid a hand on it and pulled it out by the slight root and tossed it in the moss. "Whee!" cried Delia. "I wish it was Arbor Day tomorrow, too." Mary Elizabeth stopped laughing. "I turn here," she said. "It's the short cut. Goodbye. I had a grand time. The best time I ever had." Delia pretended not to hear. She said nothing. The others called casual goodbyes over shoulder. Going home, they rebuked me soundly for having invited Mary Elizabeth. Delia rehearsed the array of reasons. If she came to school, we would have to know her, she wound up. I remember feeling baffled and without argument. All that they said was true, and yet... "I'm going to see her," I announced stoutly, more, I dare say, because I was tired of a little cross from real loyalty. "You'll catch some disease," said Delia. "I know a girl that went to see some poor children, and she caught the spinal appendicitis and died before she got back home." We went round by the schoolhouse, drawn there by a curiosity that had in it inevitable elements of regret. There they were, little dead-looking trees, standing in places of wet earth, and most of them set somewhat slanting. Everyone was gone, and in the late night the grounds looked solemn and different. "Just think," said Delia, "when we grow up, the trees grow up. We can tell our children how we planted them." "Why, we never," Callista began. "Our school did, didn't it?" Delia contended. "And our school's we, isn't it?" But we overruled her. No, to the end of time, the trees that stood in these grounds would have been planted by other hands than ours. We were probably the only ones in the school who hadn't planted a tree. "I don't care. Do you?" we demanded of one another, and reiterated our denial. "I planted Nevergreen," Harold Rodman shouted, running to meet us. "So did we told him merrily, and separated laughing. It had, it seemed, been a great day, in spite of Mary Elizabeth. I went into the house and hovered about the supper table. I perceived that I had missed hot waffles with honey, and these now held no charm. Grandmother Beers was talking. "When I was 8 years old," she said, "I planted it by the well. And when Thomas went back to England 50 years after, he couldn't reach both arms around the trunk, and there was a seat there for travelers." I looked at her and thought of that giant tree. Would those dead-looking little sticks then grow like that? "If 50,000 school children planted a tree today," said my mother, "that would be a forest. and planting a forest is the next best thing to building a city." "Better," said my father. "Better, what kind of tree did you plant, daughter?" he inquired. I hung my head. There was a picnic," I said. "We didn't have to plant 'em, so we had a picnic." My father looked at me the way that I remember. "That's it," he said. "For everyone who plants a tree, there's a half dozen that have a picnic, and 2 dozen that cut them down. At last, we've got one in the family who belongs to the majority." When I could, I slipped out in the garden. It was darkening. The frogs and the sloth were chorusing, and down the river bank a catbird sang at intervals. Was silent long enough to make you think that he had ceased, and then burst forth again. The town clock struck 8, and if 8 were an ancient thing full of dignity, our kitchen clock answered briskly, as if 8 were a proud and novel experience of its own. The bus rattled past for the 8:20, and away down in the garden I heard a step. Someone had come in the back gate and clicked the pail of stones that weighted its chain. I thought that it would be one of the girls, who not infrequently chose this inobvious method of entrance. I ran toward her and was amazed to find Mary Elizabeth kneeling quietly on the ground, as she had been when I came upon her at noon. "What you doing?" I demanded, before I could see what she was doing. "This," she said. I stooped, and she had a little maple tree, for which she was hollowing a home with a rusty fire shovel that she had brought with her. "It's the one Delia Dart pulled out," she said. "I thought it'd be kind of nice to put it here, in your yard. You could bring the water if you want." I brought the water. Together we bent in the dusk, and we set out the little tree near the back gate, close to my playhouse. "We'd ought to say a verse or something," I said vaguely. "I can't think of any," Mary Elizabeth objected. "Neither could I, but you had to say something when you planted a tree, and a line was as good as a verse. God is love's good enough," said Mary Elizabeth. Stamping the earth down, then we dismissed the event and hung briefly above the back gate. Somehow I was feeling a great and welcome sense of relief. "It was kind of nice to do that," I observed with some embarrassment. "No, it wasn't either," rejoined Mary Elizabeth modestly. We stood kicking at the gravel for a moment, then she went away. I faced about to the quiet garden, and suddenly, for no reason that I knew, I found myself skipping on the path, in the dark, just as if the day were only beginning.